Chapter 1. The door slammed with a finality that echoed through the small cottage, the sound snapping the last thread of the city's frantic noise. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the room, the sudden silence ringing in his ears like a physical blow. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, the kind that didn't just signify the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something vast and patient. He stayed there for a moment, his shoulders hunched, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts that felt too fast for the air in this room. The air smelled of old cedar, dried brine, and a faint, lingering trace of beeswax. He turned toward the cardboard boxes stacked by the hearth. They looked like ruins of a former life, packed with the efficiency of a man who had lived his existence by a calendar of 15-minute increments. He reached for the first one, the tape shrieking as he tore it open. Inside were the blankets, heavy, coarse-knit wool and shades of charcoal and moss. As he hauled them out, the wool scratched against his palms, a rough, abrasive texture that felt honest. He gripped the fabric, digging his fingers into the thick weave, letting the friction ground him. For the first time in 3 years, there was no screen to look at, no notification to answer, only the raw, physical reality of wool against skin. He draped a blanket over the armchair, the weight of it pulling his arms down, forcing him to slow his movements to match the gravity of the house. Out of habit, his left wrist twitched. He felt the phantom pressure of the leather strap and reached for his wristwatch, his mind already calculating the settling and efficiency of the afternoon. He wanted to know exactly how many minutes it would take to clear the floor, to align the furniture, to establish a perimeter of order. But as he reached for the buckle, his hand trembled. It wasn't a shake of fear, but a tremor of exhaustion, a mechanical failure of a body that had been running on adrenaline and caffeine for a decade. He stared at the watch face, a precise, ticking instrument of anxiety, and felt a sudden, visceral revulsion toward it. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt like a prayer, Silas unbuckled the strap. He walked to the bedside table, a scarred piece of pine that looked as though it had been salvaged from a shipwreck, and placed the watch face down. The ticking didn't stop, it merely changed character. Now, it echoed the frantic pace of his own heartbeat, a small, metal-sharp pulse that seemed to mock the stillness of the room. He stepped back, leaving the watch behind, feeling a strange lightness in his wrist, as if he had shed a piece of armor that had become too heavy to wear. He stood there, watching the dust motes dance in a sliver of light, listening to the house settle into its foundations. He moved to the next box, pulling out his leather-bound books. These were his anchors, archival volumes on history and botany, their spines cracked and smelling of old libraries. He began to arrange them on the built-in shelves, instinctively sorting them by category in chronological order. He reached for a volume on coastal flora, his mind already mapping out the grid of the shelf, the logic of the alphabet. But mid-action, his hand paused. He studied the book, then at the empty space beside it, and realized there was no one coming to inspect the work. There was no performance review, no deadline, no expectation of perfection. The realization hit him with a dizzying force. He was standing in a room where the only requirement was to exist. He let the book slide from his fingers. It hit the wooden table with a dull thud, the sound absorbing into the grain of the wood. Silas didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned over the table, pressing his open palm against the surface. He began to trace the grain of the pine, following the swirls and knots with a slow, steady finger. He felt the ridges where the wood had grown slow and the dips where it had surged. He focused entirely on the sensation, the coolness of the wood, the slight roughness of the varnish, the way the texture shifted under his touch. As he traced the patterns, he felt his breathing change. The shallow, city breath began to deepen, moving from his chest down into his stomach. He stayed like that for an hour, a man rediscovering the art of touch, letting the physical world anchor his drifting mind. Outside, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the side of the cottage, rattling the window panes in their frames. The glass shivered, a high-pitched vibration that cut through the silence. Silas looked toward the window, seeing the gray curtains billow inward. Beyond the glass lay the coast, a stretch of jagged cliffs and a vast, indifferent ocean that didn't care about schedules or efficiency. The sound of the wind was a reminder that he was no longer in a controlled environment. He was at the mercy of the tides and the gales. It was a frightening thought, but beneath the fear was a flicker of relief. The ocean was too big to be managed, and for the first time in his life, Silas found comfort in the idea of something that could not be optimized. As he moved to close the latch on the window, he noticed a gap between the wainscoting and the floorboards. Tucked away in the shadows, partially hidden by a heavy velvet drape that smelled of salt and thyme, was a stack of old, leather-bound journals. They were small, their covers worn to a soft, Swede-like finish, bound with twine that had begun to fray. He knelt on the floor, the cold of the board seeping through his trousers, and carefully retrieved the top volume. He opened the cover, the parchment groaning. The ink was faded, a ghostly sepia that blurred at the edges, but the handwriting was urgent. The letters were slanted, pressed hard into the paper, as if the writer had been racing against a clock or fighting a storm. There were no dates, only observations of the sea, the movement of the light across the bay, and fragmented thoughts on the nature of stillness. Silas traced the ink with his thumb, feeling the slight indentations left by the pen. He didn't read the words so much as he felt the energy behind them, a desperation to record the world before it vanished. He looked back at his watch, still lying face down on the table, and then back at the journals. He wondered who had lived in this room before him, and what they had been searching for in the silence of Oakhaven. Chapter 2. The knife hit the heavy oak block with a rhythmic, metal-sharp thud that sounded more like a construction site than a kitchen. Silas gripped the handle of the chef's knife, his knuckles white, dicing the carrots into perfect, identical cubes. Each slice was a calculated strike, a carryover from a decade of spreadsheets and quarterly reviews where precision was the only currency that mattered. He wasn't just preparing dinner, he was auditing the vegetables. He worked with a frantic, urban speed, his shoulders bunched up toward his ears, his mind still racing at a tempo that didn't belong in a village where the primary industry was the tide. He reached for the digital timer on the counter, a sleek plastic thing from his old life, and twisted the dial to 45 minutes. The click of the plastic was sharp, a definitive command. When he slid the heavy cast-iron pot onto the stove, he felt a strange, lingering need to quantify the process. He wanted a countdown. He wanted a signal that told him exactly when the transition from raw to done occurred, as if the stew were a project with a hard deadline. He stepped back, watching the steam begin to curl from the lid, but the silence of the cottage felt heavy, almost expectant, as if the walls were judging the artificiality of the beep. When the timer finally went off, the sound was a shrill, piercing violation. It ripped through the stillness of the room like a siren, echoing off the stone walls and making Silas flinch. He stared at the small red display, the beep continuing its relentless assault. For a moment, he felt a surge of irritation not at the device, but at the way it had fractured the fragile peace he had been trying to cultivate. He reached out to kill the sound, his finger hovering over the stop button, but he paused. He studied the pot, then at the timer, and felt a sudden, visceral rejection of the machine. He didn't press stop. He unplugged the device entirely and slid it into the back of a dusty cupboard, hiding it behind a stack of mismatched plates. He stood there in the sudden return of silence, his breath slow and deep through his nose. He decided he would not use a clock. He would wait for the house to tell him. He would wait for the food to tell him. It was a terrifying prospect, to operate without a metric, but, as he leaned over the pot, he felt a flicker of curiosity. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the gray coast outside the window, and let his olfactory senses take the lead. At first, the smell was merely heat and water, a blank canvas of steam. Then, the sharp, sulfuric tang of the onions began to emerge, cutting through the air with a pungent, aggressive clarity that reminded him of street markets in the rain. He waited. He didn't move, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, his fingers tracing the cool ceramic rim of a nearby mug. He focused on the shift. Slowly, the sharpness of the onion began to mellow, folding into the deeper, loamier scent of the parsnips. It was a heavy smell, reminiscent of wet earth and cellar-stored roots, a scent that felt grounded and ancient. He could smell the thyme now, a herbal, woody note that drifted upward in thin ribbons. He stayed in that sensory vacuum, ignoring the phantom itch in his mind that told him he should be checking the internal temperature with a probe. He was learning to listen with his nose, distinguishing the exact moment the vegetable stopped fighting the heat and began to surrender to it. There was a pivotal shift in the aroma, a thickening. The scent evolved from a collection of individual ingredients into a singular, rich harmony. The raw had vanished, replaced by a savory, caramelized depth that felt warm and enveloping. It was a scent that didn't just hit the nostrils, it settled in the chest. He realized the stew was ready not because a plastic chip had reached zero, but because the air in the kitchen had become dense with the smell of comfort. He felt a strange sense of victory, a small but significant reclamation of his own intuition over his training. He lifted the lid, a plume of white steam engulfing his face. He dipped a silver spoon into the broth, bringing a small amount to his lips. He tasted it, and his brow furrowed. The salt was off, not absent, but unbalanced, lacking the brightness needed to lift the earthy weight of the root vegetables. He didn't reach for a measuring spoon. Instead, he took a pinch of coarse sea salt between his thumb and forefinger, letting the grains fall slowly into the bubbling liquid. He stirred it once clockwise, then tasted again. Still not quite there. He added another pinch, smaller this time, watching the crystals dissolve into the brown depths. He repeated this process 4 times, a slow, deliberate titration, until the flavor finally snapped into focus, the salt acting as a bridge between the sweetness of the carrots and the musk of the parsnips. As he stirred, the warmth of the cast-iron pot seeped through the wooden handle and into his fingertips. The heat was steady and honest. He felt the tension in his shoulders. The residual tightness from years of bracing against a city that never stopped screaming finally began to dissolve. He felt himself sinking into the floor, his posture softening, his breath becoming a rhythmic accompaniment to the slow bubble of the stew. He wasn't thinking about the journals he had found, or the mysterious history of the cottage, or the daunting emptiness of his new life. He was simply a man in a kitchen, tending to a pot of vegetables. He ladled the stew into a wide, chipped ceramic bowl, the liquid thick and steaming. As he carried the bowl toward the door, intending to take his meal to the small porch, he stopped. He noticed that the aroma didn't stay confined to the kitchen. It had drifted through the hallway and escaped through the slightly ajar front door, carrying the scent of thyme and roasted root vegetables out into the salt-heavy air of the coast. The smell was a beacon, a warm, domestic signal sent out into the wild, indifferent gray of Oakhaven. He stepped onto the porch, the cold wind nipping at his ankles, but the bowl in his hands was a portable hearth. As he looked toward the harbor path, a narrow ribbon of gravel that wound through the seagrass, he saw a figure. It was a man, distant and blurred by the mist, but he had stopped walking. The figure was standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were catching a scent on the breeze. The stranger didn't wave or call out. He simply stood there, drawn by the invisible thread of the stew's aroma. Silas watched him, feeling a sudden, sharp awareness of his own vulnerability and the strange, magnetic power of a simple, slow-cooked meal in a place where everything else felt fragmented and cold. Chapter 3. The man on the path did not move, but the invitation was there, written in the sudden stillness of his posture. Silas stepped off the porch, his boots crunching into the damp gravel of the harbor path. He felt a surge of that old, familiar electricity, the urban impulse to close the distance quickly, to resolve the encounter, to tick the box of introduction and move on to the next task. He began to march, his stride long and purposeful, his shoulders tight. He was walking as if the lighthouse at the end of the peninsula were a boardroom he was late for, his mind already calculating the most efficient route, the shortest time of arrival, the optimal way to initiate a conversation with a stranger. But Oakhaven resisted the sprint. The path narrowed, winding through clumps of salt-stunted grass that whipped against his trousers. As he pushed forward, the sound of the Atlantic rose to meet him, a heavy rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the soles of his feet. It wasn't a chaotic noise, it was a percussion. Crash. Pause. Hiss. The tide was hitting the billout shelves with a regularity that felt like a heartbeat. Silas tried to maintain his pace, but the sound began to act as a friction. Every time he sped up, the roar of the water seemed to widen, creating a sonic wall that pushed back against his urgency. He found his breathing hitching, out of sync with the environment, until the sheer volume of the sea drowned out the buzzing noise of his own thoughts. Slowly, almost against his will, his heels began to drop in time with the surf. The internal metronome of the city, the ticking clock, the ping of the notification, was being overwritten by the tide. By the time the lighthouse came into full view, a white finger pointing stubbornly at the gray sky, Silas was no longer marching. He was drifting. At the base of the tower stood the man. He was draped in a heavy, charcoal-colored wool coat that seemed to absorb the mist around him. He wasn't looking at the sea, nor was he looking at Silas. His gaze was fixed on his own hands, where a string of dark wooden prayer beads rotated between his thumb and forefinger. The movement was hypnotic, a slow, circular migration of spheres that mirrored the rotation of the great lens high above. The man didn't speak as Silas approached. He simply continued the rhythm, the beads clicking softly, a tiny sound that somehow pierced through the roar of the waves. "The stew smelled of thyme," the man said, His voice was a low, resonant hum, less a sequence of words and more a vibration that seemed to originate in his chest. He finally looked up, his eyes possessing a clarity that felt invasive, as if he were reading the footnotes of Silas's life. And a certain amount of hesitation. Silas stopped a few feet away, his hands instinctively finding the pockets of his coat. He felt the urge to fill the silence, to project a version of himself that was composed and intentional. "I'm Silas. I just moved into the cottage down the path. I didn't mean to, I don't know, signal anyone with the cooking. I was just trying to get a meal right." "Tenzin," the man replied, the beads slowing their rotation. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity. "Tell me, Silas, are you chasing the horizon, or are you running from it?" The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Silas felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation, the kind that usually preceded a defensive argument. Who is this to ask that? I've spent 10 years building a career, sacrificing sleep, sculpting a life out of sheer will, and I come here for peace, not a riddle from a man in a wool coat. He opened his mouth to explain the logistics of his arrival. The burnout, the strategic decision to relocate, the carefully curated plan for his recovery that involved the structured schedule of reading and mindful walking. He wanted to explain that this wasn't a whim, but a calculated reclamation of his mental health. He wanted to lay out the blueprint of his healing as if it were a project proposal. But as the words gathered in his throat, he studied Tenzin's face. There was no judgment there, only a vast, open patience. The silence stretched, expanding to fill the space between them. Silas felt the pressure of his own words becoming heavy, redundant. He realized that to explain his plan was to remain trapped in the logic of the city, to treat his soul like a broken appliance that could be fixed with the right set of instructions. He closed his mouth. He let the proposal die. He let the silence swallow the need to be understood. They stood together for 5 minutes. To a city dweller, 5 minutes of silence is an eternity. It is a vacuum that must be filled with apologies or small talk. But here, under the shadow of the beacon, the silence felt like a physical object, a shared blanket. Silas watched a single bead move from Tenzin's thumb to his index finger. He listened to the wind whistle through the railing of the lighthouse gallery. He felt the cold dampness of the mist settling on his eyelashes. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for his turn to speak. He was simply existing in the presence of another human being, two ghosts leaning against the edge of the world, acknowledging the invisible weight they both carried. Tenzin's weight of solitude, Silas's weight of noise. "The sea is a patient teacher," Tenzin said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the wind. He extended a weathered hand toward the shoreline, where the water was beginning to pull back, exposing the dark, glistening ribs of the beach. It only gives back what it is finished with. It keeps the things that still belong to the depths, and it discards the things that no longer have a purpose. Silas followed his gaze. As the tide receded further, leaving a mirror-like sheen of water on the sand, something caught the light. It wasn't the dull glint of a seashell or the matte gray of a pebble. It was a sharp, artificial flash, a sliver of polished chrome or steel. It sat half buried in the wet grit, an anomaly in the organic sweep of the coast. As they walked closer, the object revealed itself. It was a rectangular piece of metal, perhaps the size of a handheld tablet, but with edges that were surgically precise and a surface that remained impossibly clean despite the salt and sand. It looked too heavy for the sand it rested in, and far too modern for the timeless, weathered atmosphere of Oakhaven. It looked like a fragment of a world Silas had tried to leave behind, washed up on the shore like a piece of futuristic wreckage. He reached down to touch it, but Tenzin's hand moved slightly, a silent warning to wait. Silas froze, his fingers inches from the cold metal, wondering why something so precise had found its way into a place designed for the slow and the broken. Chapter 4. The chrome fragment remained on the sand, a cold geometric scar against the organic curve of the coast, but Tenzin had already steered Silas away from it. They retreated to the lighthouse keeper's quarters, a circular room that smelled of old beeswax, dried kelp, and the faint sharp tang of lamp oil. The wind rattled the heavy glass panes of the windows, a rhythmic shudder that felt like the building itself was shivering. Tenzin did not speak of the object they had found. Instead, he moved toward a heavy cast-iron stove where a blackened kettle was already beginning to whistle, a low, steady sound that anchored the room. Steam rose in thick, swirling ribbons from the teapot as Tenzin poured the liquid with a steady, unwavering hand. He didn't use a measuring cup or a timer. He judged the steep by the scent and the shifting hue of the water. The tea was a deep amber gold, smelling of roasted barley and something sharp, like pine needles after a rain. He placed a heavy ceramic mug in front of Silas. The mug was uneven, the glaze a mottled seafoam green with a thumbprint indentation where the potter had held it. Silas gripped the warm ceramic, the heat seeping into his palms and grounding him, pulling his awareness away from the phantom vibration of a phone that wasn't in his pocket. "Close your eyes," Tenzin said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a ritual. Silas hesitated, his fingers rubbing the rough rim of the mug. The habit of vigilance was a hard skin to shed. In the city, closing one's eyes in a public space was a surrender of territory. He felt the urge to scan the room, to check the time, to categorize the sounds around him into a hierarchy of urgency. But the warmth of the tea was a physical tether, and slowly he let his eyelids drop. The darkness was not empty. It was a canvas of deep purples and reds where the light of the stove played against his retinas. "Do not listen for the wind," Tenzin's voice hummed, resonant and low. "The wind is a distraction. It is the noise of the world moving. Listen beneath it. Find 3 distinct sounds that do not belong to the air. Name them." Silas concentrated. He tightened his jaw, his mind automatically switching into a filtering mode, searching for important noise. A warning, a call, a signal. He heard the rhythmic tick of a wall clock, a mechanical heartbeat that felt too fast. He heard the distant muffled clink of a tea tin being closed. But as he reached for a third, his mind began to spiral. He felt the familiar prickle of agitation in his chest, the restlessness of a man who felt he was wasting time by simply sitting in a chair. He wanted to ask why they were doing this, how long it would take, what the objective was. The silence of the room began to feel like a vacuum, pulling at the edges of his composure. "I can't," Silas whispered, his voice sounding thin to his own ears. "It's just... everything is blending together. It's just noise." "You are listening for a message," Tenzin observed. He didn't sound critical. He sounded like a biologist observing a specimen. "You are waiting for the sound to tell you something about your status, or your schedule, or your safety. Stop listening for the meaning. Listen for the vibration." Tenzin leaned closer, and Silas could hear the slow, rhythmic rotation of the prayer beads in the older man's hand, a dry, wooden click-clack that mirrored the tide. Silas forced himself to breathe, a slow, deep nasal breath that expanded his ribs. He stopped trying to categorize. He stopped trying to solve the puzzle of the sound. He let the noise wash over him like the salt spray on the beach, letting the boundaries of his own body blur into the room. Then he heard it. It wasn't a sound so much as a pressure. A low-frequency sigh, a subterranean groan that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his teeth. It was a deep, hollow resonance, the sound of a massive volume of water being pushed into the mouth of a sea cave and then retreating with a heavy, exhausted exhale. It was the breath of the ocean. A slow, tidal respiration that made the lighthouse feel less like a building and more like a buoy floating on a vast, breathing lung. Silas opened his eyes. The tension in his shoulders had dropped an inch. He studied the tea, now shimmering in the dim light of the room. The sound was still there, a constant, humming presence that filled the gaps between the wind. It was the first time he had felt the scale of the world around him without feeling crushed by it. "It sounds like it's tired," Silas said softly. "The ocean is never tired," Tenzin replied, a slight knowing tilt of his head. "It is simply patient." They sat in silence for a long while. The warmth of the mug had faded to a gentle heat, and the steam no longer rose in ribbons but in thin, ghostly wisps. The silence between them stretched, but it had changed. It was no longer a vacuum. It was a mirror. In that stillness, Silas felt the sudden, jarring contrast of his own inner architecture. He thought of the calendars he used to keep, the color-coded blocks of time that dictated when he ate, when he slept, and when he was allowed to feel a semblance of peace. The realization hit him with a sudden, sharp vulnerability that made his throat tighten. "I don't know how to do this," Silas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his hands, which were still gripping the mug, as if it were a life raft. "I don't know how to exist without a schedule. If I'm not moving toward a goal, I feel like I'm disappearing. I feel like if I stop producing something, I stop being someone." Tenzin did not offer a platitude. He didn't tell Silas that he would learn in time, or that the city was a lie. He didn't offer a map or a set of instructions, for instructions were exactly what Silas had used to build his own prison. Instead, Tenzin reached into the pocket of his heavy wool cardigan and withdrew a small, smooth stone. It was a river pebble, a deep charcoal gray, polished to a mirror finish by centuries of water. With a slow, deliberate motion, Tenzin slid the stone across the wooden table. It moved with a soft, scraping sound, coming to a halt just inches from Silas's hand. The stone was small, insignificant, and entirely devoid of purpose. It didn't track time, it didn't provide data, and it didn't satisfy a requirement. Silas stared at the pebble. He felt a surge of restlessness, a desire to move, to organize the table, to do anything other than look at a piece of rock. He wanted to ask what the stone represented, to find the metaphor and file it away in a folder in his mind. But Tenzin remained motionless, his gaze steady and unblinking, his presence a heavy anchor in the room. Tenzin leaned in, the scent of barley and salt clinging to him. His voice was a low hum, piercing through the remaining layers of Silas's urban armor. "Tell me, Silas Thorn," Tenzin asked, the question landing with a precision that felt almost surgical. "Who are you when you have nothing to prove?" Chapter 5. The bell above the door gave a single, thin chime that cut through the damp morning air, announcing Silas's arrival with a clarity that felt almost intrusive. He stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted instantly from the brine and gray mist of the coast to a thick, golden humidity. The air was a heavy, intoxicating suspension of toasted yeast and wild lavender, a scent so dense it felt as though he were walking through a warm curtain. It was a smell that didn't just hit the nose, it settled in the back of the throat, tasting of honey and earth. Silas stopped just inside the threshold, his fingers instinctively reaching for the phantom weight of a phone in his pocket, a habit of checking the time to ensure he wasn't lagging behind a phantom schedule. Fatima al-Sayed was behind the counter, her movements a blur of practiced, frantic efficiency. She was arranging a row of sourdough boules with a precision that bordered on the desperate, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. When she looked up and saw him, a warm, breathy chuckle escaped her, though it didn't quite reach the tightness in her eyes. She leaned in slightly, her gaze scanning his face with the practiced eye of a chemist. "You're carrying the lighthouse with you today, Silas," she said, her voice like a soft wool blanket. "Your jaw is locked so tight I can practically hear the gears grinding from here. Come. Stop thinking. Just breathe the air." She didn't wait for him to answer. Reaching beneath the wooden counter, she produced a small, round loaf infused with lavender. It was still radiating a fierce, honest heat. She pushed it into his hands, and Silas felt the crust crackle, a tiny, rhythmic percussion beneath his fingertips. The bread was heavy, the weight of it grounding him, forcing his attention away from the looping questions Tenzin had left him with. He felt the warmth seep through his palms and into his wrists, a slow migration of heat that seemed to dissolve the rigidity of his posture. He didn't eat it immediately, he simply held it, letting the scent of the dried purple flowers mingle with the toasted grain, a sensory anchor that stopped the world from spinning for a few seconds. As he stood there, the bread warming his chest, Silas noticed the tremor. Fatima was reaching for a tray of cinnamon rolls, and her fingers were shaking. A fine, high-frequency vibration that she tried to mask by gripping the metal edge of the tray too hard. Her linen apron was dusted in a fine layer of white flour, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of warm lighting could hide. She was moving too fast, her rhythm out of sync with the slow pulse of Oakhaven. She was curating a sanctuary for everyone else, but in the process, she was fraying at the edges, treating her own exhaustion as a secondary concern to the perfection of the display. Silas looked at the flour sacks stacked near the back door, heavy burlap cylinders that looked as though they had been dragged in by a tide. He saw the way Fatima glanced at them, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face before she forced a smile back onto her lips. The urban professional in him wanted to calculate the efficiency of the layout, to suggest a trolley or a different storage system, but the man who had spent the last hour staring at a purposeless pebble knew better. He didn't offer a solution, he offered his strength. "Let me," Silas said. His voice was soft, the long pause before the words acting as a bridge. He stepped around the counter, bypassing the polished displays, and moved toward the sacks. Fatima started to protest, her hand rising in a reflexive gesture of independence. "I have a system, Silas, I can manage." "Your system is shaking," he interrupted gently. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the coarse texture of the burlap. He gripped the first sack, the fabric scratching his palms, and lifted it with a slow, deliberate heave. He felt the strain in his shoulders, a physical exertion that was honest and uncomplicated. There was no KPI for this, no quarterly review, only the simple reality of weight and gravity. He moved the sacks one by one to the mixing station, his breath deepening, the nasal rhythm Tenzin had encouraged him to adopt beginning to take hold. When the last sack was in place, Silas stood back, his chest heaving slightly. Fatima had stopped moving. She was standing still for the first time since he had entered the shop, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression softening into something vulnerable. The mask of the tireless provider had slipped, leaving behind a woman who looked profoundly tired. She studied him not as a customer or a newcomer, but as someone who had actually seen her. "No one ever asks if I need help with the flour," she whispered, her voice losing its breathy cheer and becoming something more raw. "They just expect the bread to be there when they wake up." They stood in the silence for a long minute, the only sound the distant hum of the refrigeration unit and the muffled crash of the tide against the village seawall. Between them, on the cooling rack, sat a bundle of fresh rosemary. The fragrance drifted toward them, sharp, piney, and clear. It acted as a bridge, a shared sensory point that required no explanation. Silas felt a strange kinship with her. In that moment, they were both practitioners of a kind of performance, he with his perceived competence and she with her relentless generosity. Both had been running on a treadmill that didn't exist in Oakhaven, yet they had brought the machinery with them in their minds. Silas rubbed the ceramic rim of a nearby vase, his thumb tracing the curve of the clay. He thought of the river pebble in his pocket and the question Tenzin had posed, "Who are you when you have nothing to prove?" He realized that helping Fatima wasn't about proving he was useful or helpful. It was simply the act of noticing another person's fragility. It was the first time in years he had acted without wondering how the action would be perceived or recorded. As he prepared to leave, the mist had thickened outside, blurring the edges of the street into a watercolor wash of gray and violet. Fatima stepped forward and reached beneath the counter again, but this time she didn't produce food. She handed him a small amber glass vial filled with a pale, shimmering oil. "Lavender and sandalwood," she said, her voice returning to its warm hum, though it was now tempered with a genuine softness. "Rub it on your temples when the noise in your head gets too loud. But be careful, Silas." He paused, the vial cool against his skin. "Careful of what?" Fatima looked toward the window, where the village of Oakhaven lay shrouded in its timeless fog. "The peace here is a fragile thing," she warned, her eyes turning serious. "It is a thin skin over a very deep ocean. It can be broken by a single loud heart, someone who brings the storm of the city inside them and forgets how to let it go. Don't let your ghosts wake the village." Silas stepped back out into the cold, the door clicking shut behind him. He held the vial in one hand and the warm bread in the other. As he walked back toward his cottage, the scent of lavender clung to his clothes, but his mind was suddenly fixed on the amber glass. He wondered what Fatima meant by a loud heart, and whether the vibration he had seen in her hands was a result of her own ghosts, or a reaction to something else entirely that lived in the quiet of the coast. Chapter 6. Ishani stood at the edge of the seed beds, her linen apron so perfectly smooth it looked as though it had been pressed into the fabric of the garden itself. She did not speak at first. She simply watched Silas approach, her gaze steady and clinical, as if he were a potential invasive species that might disrupt the delicate pH of the soil. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed mint, a heavy green perfume that seemed to cling to the skin. Silas stopped several feet away, his hands deep in his pockets, mindful of the space she maintained around her perimeter of meticulously pruned boxwoods. "The heirloom collection is in the potting shed," Ishani said, her voice crisp and clear, lacking any harshness but possessing the firmness of a closing gate. "It is not a place for wandering or curiosity. It is a place for precision. If you are to be of any use this morning, Silas, you must understand that in this garden, a millimeter is the difference between a harvest and a memory." She led him into the dim, cool interior of the shed, where the smell of cedar and dried peat moss reigned. On a heavy oak table sat a series of small, hand-blown glass vials and a tray of silver tweezers. The seeds were tiny, iridescent specks of gold, charcoal, and mahogany scattered across a white linen cloth. Ishani pointed to the empty packets lined up in a perfect row. "These are the legacy seeds of Oakhaven. Some date back 4 generations. You will sort them by variety and count. No more than 3 seeds per packet, no fewer. If you are unsure of a seed's origin, you set it aside in the waste tray. Do not guess. Guessing is for those who have the luxury of failure." Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the ghost of 1,000 corporate deadlines, but as he studied the seeds, the feeling shifted. He reached for the tweezers, his fingers finding a steady grip. He had spent a decade in the archives of a city museum, cataloging fragments of pottery and torn edges of vellum. He knew the liturgy of the small. He picked up a single, teardrop-shaped seed, its surface etched with microscopic ridges. He moved it slowly, deliberately, into the first packet. 1, 2, 3. The rhythmic click of the tweezers against the glass began to sync with his breathing. The noise of the city, the phantom sirens, and the relentless hum of the subway seemed to recede, replaced by the singular, quiet focus of the task. Ishani hovered just behind his shoulder, her presence a cold current of air. She didn't speak for 10 minutes, but Silas could feel her eyes tracing the movement of his wrist. Suddenly she reached out, her fingers not touching him but guiding the air around his hand. "Your grip is too tight," she said, her voice a melodic correction. "You are holding the tweezers as if you are fighting the seed. Do not conquer the seed, Silas. Simply escort it. Loosen your thumb. Let the tool be an extension of the breath, not a vice." Silas exhaled, consciously relaxing the tension in his forearm. He adjusted his hold, feeling the silver instrument lighten in his hand. He returned to the task, the repetition becoming a form of meditation. He stopped thinking about the clock or the perceived judgment of the woman beside him. Instead, he focused on the tactile reality, the coolness of the glass, the grainy texture of the linen, the way the dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the shed's rafters. For the first time since arriving in Oakhaven, the precision he craved didn't feel like a shield against chaos. It felt like a conversation with the earth. As the hour passed, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of an interrogation, but the shared, rhythmic quiet of two people working in synchronicity. The tension in Ishani's posture seemed to dissolve. The rigid line of her shoulders softened, and she began to sort a second tray of seeds beside him, her movements mirroring his own. They worked in a wordless loop, the only sound the occasional clink of metal and the distant rhythmic wash of the tide against the village seawall. "These seeds are the only record we have left of the old coastal varieties," Ishani said suddenly, her voice lower now, almost a confession. "The salt spray and the shifting winds of the last decade have claimed most of the wild patches. If a single packet is contaminated or lost, a century of adaptation vanishes. We aren't just planting gardens, Silas. We are maintaining a library of survival. To lose a seed is to burn a book." Silas looked at the row of packets, then at the handwritten labels, which were beginning to fade into a jaundiced yellow. Some of the ink had bled, making the distinctions between the Winch kale and the coastal brassica perilously thin. He paused, his tweezers hovering over a charcoal-colored seed. "The labeling system is precarious," he murmured, his voice soft and measured. "If we were to reorganize them by growth cycle rather than just variety, and perhaps use an archival ink that resists humidity, we could prevent the risk of misidentification for the next few decades. It would create a secondary index for the village records." Ishani froze. He could see her mind weighing the risk of change against the safety of tradition. For a long moment, she stared at the fading ink, her thumb smoothing an invisible crease in her apron. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "The ink is a reasonable request. The reorganization, we shall see. But you will be the one to draft the index. I will not have my archives reorganized by a whim." A small, unexpected victory warmed Silas's chest, a feeling of belonging that didn't require a checklist to validate. He felt a strange surge of gratitude toward Ishani. Her rigidity had provided the exact structure he needed to find his own stillness. They stepped out of the shed together, the sunlight now blindingly bright after the dimness of the potting room. In the center of the garden, nestled between two weathered stone pillars, stood a rare, pale bloom, a ghost lily, its petals a translucent, shimmering white that seemed to vibrate against the deep green of the foliage. It had opened in the last hour, a fragile masterpiece of nature. Ishani moved toward it, her face lit with a rare, genuine smile. But as she leaned in to inspect the flower, the smile vanished. She stopped abruptly, her hand hovering inches from the stem. Her face went pale, the color draining away until she looked as ghostly as the lily itself. Silas stepped forward, following her gaze. There, tracing a jagged obsidian line up the pale green stem, was a series of weeping, necrotic spots, a blight, aggressive and dark, eating the plant from the inside out. The beauty of the bloom remained, but the foundation was rotting, and the wind that swept in from the ocean carried a sudden, sharp chill that smelled of decay. Chapter 7. Chapter title: The Changing Hue of Blue. The weathered planks of the pier groaned under Silas's weight, a rhythmic complaint mirroring the slow heave of the tide. Dike was already there, a motionless fixture against the salt-scoured horizon. He sat cross-legged on a frayed canvas tarp, his watercolor brush poised a fraction of an inch above a sheet of cold-pressed paper. He didn't look up. He simply existed in the space, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed his linen shirt. Silas lowered himself slowly, mindful of the salt-crusted splinters and the smell of drying kelp. He sat a respectful distance away, back against a damp piling. For a moment, the old city ghost clawed at his throat, the buzzing instinct to fill the void. He felt the phantom pressure of a phone in his pocket, and the urge to offer some polite, meaningless observation about the weather. His mind began constructing a series of safe, conversational bridges to ease the friction of silence. He caught himself mid-breath. He remembered Tenzin's voice reminding him that silence wasn't a hole to be filled, but a vessel to be held. Silas closed his eyes and took a deep nasal breath, smelling brine and the sharp tang of Dike's paints. He relaxed his shoulders, letting the tension drain into the wood. He decided to let the silence be enough. When he opened his eyes, he stopped looking at Dike and started looking at the water. He had always thought of the bay as blue, a static category. But as he sat, the world shifted in glacial increments. Near the pier, the water was a translucent turquoise, revealing swaying forests of seagrass. Further out, it deepened into a bruised malachite, and then, as the sun pivoted behind a veil of high clouds, the expanse shifted into a shimmering indigo. It was a slow bleed of shadow that altered the mood of the entire coast. He tracked a single piece of driftwood, a bleached white rib of something ancient, bobbing in the current. He watched the indigo water curl around the wood in frothing eddies of cream and silver. The urban clock in his head, which measured life in 15-minute increments and deliverables, simply stopped. He thought of the digital watch on his bedside table back at the cottage, a sleek band of precision, and it felt like a relic from a prehistoric era. Dike's hand moved. It was a gesture so slight it was almost invisible, a mere tilt of the wrist. The brush finally met the paper, depositing a wash of color that mirrored the deepening bay. The movement was fluid, as if the paint were flowing from the ocean through Dike's arm. He didn't paint the water as a flat surface, he painted the weight of it, the pressure of the depths, and the way the light struggled to penetrate the surface. "Wait," Dike whispered. The word was barely a breath, but it carried the weight of a command. Silas froze. For a heartbeat, the surface remained a mirror of dark glass. Then the bay erupted. A school of silver fish, thousands of them, broke the surface in a shimmering explosion. They leapt in synchronized arcs, their scales scattering the dying light into a million fractured diamonds. The rhythmic splashing shattered the stillness of the pier. Dike didn't scramble. He waited for the peak of the frenzy, then applied a single decisive streak of iridescent white across the indigo wash. He captured the essence of the movement rather than the movement itself. The fish vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind widening concentric circles that smoothed into a flat, silent plain. Silas felt a sudden swell of kinship. He studied Dike, and for the first time, the artist turned his head. Dike's eyes were calm, his blinking slow. There was no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement. He accepted Silas's presence as a natural fact, like the tide or the wind. Dike shifted, adding muted, earthy tones to the background, the gray-brown of the pier, the soft ochre of the shoreline, and then a blurred silhouette of a man sitting against a piling. Silas watched as he was integrated into the landscape. Dike wasn't painting a portrait of a visitor. He was painting Silas as part of the bay's geography. The realization sent a wave of warmth through him. He wasn't an interloper anymore, but a shadow in the indigo. They sat for another hour, the silence a shared sanctuary. The sun began its final descent, bleeding a bruised purple into the edges of the sky. The air grew colder, the salt spray turning into a fine mist. Silas felt a profound equilibrium, as if the internal noise that had plagued him for years had been dampened by the mass of the ocean. As the light faded to charcoal gray, Silas stood and stretched. He looked out past the breakwater, where the horizon met the darkening sea. That was when he saw it. About a mile out, anchored beyond the bay, sat a boat. It wasn't a local trawler with peeling paint and rusted hulls. This vessel was sleek, a matte charcoal color that absorbed the remaining light, making it look like a hole cut out of the ocean. It sat motionless, no lights visible, no wake trailing behind it. It was a dark, predatory shape watching the village of Oakhaven with clinical intensity. Silas frowned. The peace of the afternoon suddenly frayed. He studied Dickie, who was carefully packing his paints into a wooden box. The artist seemed unaware of the ship, or perhaps he simply found it unworthy of note. Silas looked back at the dark hull, feeling a sharp prickle of intuition. The boat didn't belong to the rhythm of the coast. It was a foreign object of precision and steel in a world of salt and slow breath. He stepped closer to the edge of the pier, squinting through the gloom. The boat didn't move, but he felt as though he were being observed. The tranquility he had cultivated felt suddenly fragile, like the ghost lily in Ashani's garden, beautiful but susceptible to a hidden rot. "Who is that out there?" Silas asked, his voice jarringly loud in the twilight. Chapter 8. Dickie didn't look up. He didn't even pause the slow, rhythmic movement of his brush against the watercolor paper. He merely blinked, a long, slow shudder of the eyelids, and whispered, "The sea brings many things, Silas. Some are meant to be seen, others are meant to be ignored." Silas stayed on the pier for a few minutes more, the wind tugging at the collar of his coat. The matte charcoal vessel remained a void on the horizon, a piece of clinical geometry that refused to blend into the organic smudge of the twilight. It felt like a puncture wound in the silence of Oakhaven. He wanted to ask more, to demand what kind of one-way glass was likely staring back at him, but the weight of Dicey's indifference acted as a dampener. By the time Silas walked back to his cottage, the boat had been swallowed by the indigo dark, leaving behind only a cold, humming tension in the pit of his stomach. Morning arrived, not with a crash, but with a slow bleed of pale gold through the curtains. Silas woke with a lingering restlessness, his mind instinctively leaping toward a mental checklist of tasks, a ghost of the city's frantic cadence. He fought the impulse, forcing himself to breathe in through his nose, smelling the salt-heavy air and the faint, lingering scent of the root vegetable stew from the night before. He didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he drifted toward the library, a narrow room at the back of the cottage where the air felt thicker, weighted by the presence of 1,000 dormant voices. He spent the first hour simply standing there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The library smelled of vanilla, old glue, and the sharp tang of cold stone. There was a cathedral of dust motes dancing in narrow shafts of sunlight. The shelves were mahogany, warped slightly by the humidity of a century of coastal winters, and they groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes that looked as though they had been breathed upon by generations of sailors and scholars. Silas felt a sudden, fierce need to bring order to the chaos, not with the aggressive efficiency of a corporate auditor, but with the reverence of a curator. He began with the botany section. He moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, lifting each book by the spine and supporting the covers with both palms to avoid stressing the fragile binding. The paper was vellum, or heavy rag, the texture like dried skin under his fingertips. He found himself mesmerized by the physical act of organization, the way the books clicked together when aligned, the soft thwump of a heavy tome settling onto a shelf. He wasn't just sorting information, he was smoothing out the jagged edges of his own mind. As he reached for a 19th century volume on the flora of the northern coast, a small, brittle object slid from between the pages and landed on the floor with a sound like a breaking fingernail. Silas knelt, his knees popping in the silence. It was a pressed wildflower, its petals translucent and drained of their original vibrancy, yet still holding a ghostly, iridescent violet hue. He recognized the serrated edge of the leaf and the delicate curve of the stamen immediately. It was the same species as the ghost lily in Ashani's garden, the one she guarded with such fierce, quiet precision. He held the flower between two fingers, barely touching it, and a sudden spike of interiority hit him. This isn't a coincidence, he thought. The lily isn't just a plant, it's a tether. He realized that the beauty of Oakhaven wasn't a random gift of geography or a fluke of the soil. It was a preserved legacy, a deliberate act of stewardship passed down through hands that valued the slow growth of a flower over the rapid growth of a portfolio. He felt a sudden, piercing clarity. The village was a living museum, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't want to be the visitor taking notes. He wanted to be part of the exhibit. He wanted to be the kind of man who cared if a single petal was bruised. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room where his suitcase sat. It was a high-end, hard-shell piece of luggage, matte black and streamlined, looking utterly absurd in the presence of the mahogany shelves. It looked like a piece of the charcoal boat that had haunted him the previous evening. A tool for transit, a vessel for someone who was always on the way to somewhere else. A wave of genuine repulsion surged through him. The thought of returning to the glass towers, the synchronized calendars, and the sterile hum of the city felt like a regression, a descent into a noise that would drown out the rhythm of the tides. Silas sat in the golden light that now flooded the room, leaning back against the cool stone wall. He stayed there for an hour, motionless, listening to the distant cry of a gull and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that had long since lost its accuracy. He considered his ambition, the titles, the prestige, the relentless climb toward a summit that offered nothing but a thinner atmosphere. He weighed it against the smell of old paper and the quiet companionship of Tenzin and Daiki. The trade felt effortless. The cost of his ambition was a price he was more than happy to pay, provided the payment was his permanent residence in this salt-stained sanctuary. He stood up and walked to the small writing desk in the corner. He took out a sheet of heavy cream stationery and a fountain pen, the ink a deep midnight blue. He didn't draft the letter in his head first, he simply let the pen move. His handwriting, usually a hurried scrawl of shorthand and urgency, was slow and deliberate. Each letter was formed with intention, the loops of the EGGS and SIS lingering on the page. To the board, he wrote, the ink glistening wetly in the light. I am resigning my position, effective immediately. Do not attempt to negotiate. There is a silence here that I have spent my entire life trying to hear, and I finally found it. He didn't feel the expected jolt of fear or the phantom pressure of a missed deadline. Instead, he felt a lightness in his chest, as if he had finally set down a heavy suitcase he hadn't realized he was carrying. He folded the paper with a crisp, clean crease and set it aside, the act feeling like the closing of a heavy iron door. As he returned to the botany text to return the pressed flower to its sanctuary, his finger brushed against the inside of the back cover. There was a slight irregularity in the cardboard, a hidden pocket created by a double layer of binding. He slid his finger inside and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of cedar and brine. He unfolded it carefully on the desk. It wasn't a letter or a diary entry. It was a hand-drawn map of the coast, executed in faded ink with a level of detail that bordered on the obsessive. However, as he compared the lines to the official charts he had seen in the village office, he noticed a glaring discrepancy. The map marked a small, crescent-shaped cove and a jagged outcrop of rock 3 miles north of the lighthouse, a location that didn't exist on any modern map of Oakhaven. There was a single, handwritten word scrawled across the hidden cove in a tight, disciplined script. Sovereign. Chapter 9. The linen tablecloth was a heavy, oatmeal-colored weave that felt like river stone beneath Silas's fingertips. He spent 10 minutes centering it on the mahogany table, not because a misplaced inch would invite disaster, but because the act of alignment had become a form of prayer. He placed 3 beeswax candles in mismatched brass holders, their wicks thick and smelling of wild clover. In the city, lighting a candle had been a desperate attempt to mask the scent of smog, or a frantic ritual to ward off a migraine during a midnight deadline. Now, as he struck a long match and watched the flame bloom, the light didn't fight the shadows. It invited them in, softening the edges of the room into a warm amber haze. In the kitchen, the air was a dense tapestry of scents. He had eschewed the digital timer entirely, leaving it face down on the counter like a discarded relic. Instead, he listened to the rhythms of the stove. The first dish, a slow-roasted cauliflower with honey and thyme, was ready when the scent shifted from earthy to a deep, caramelized sweetness that tickled the back of his throat. He watched the edges of the florets turn a charred, golden brown, the oil sizzling in a low, consistent hum. He didn't check a clock. He waited for the smell to reach a peak of richness, a sensory signal that the sugars had finally surrendered to the heat. Next came the risotto, a process that required a patience he would have found agonizing 6 months ago. He stirred the arborio rice with a wooden spoon, feeling the friction of the grains against the pot. He added the vegetable stock 1 ladle at a time, waiting for the rice to drink the liquid before offering more. He didn't rush the process. He focused on the sound, the wet, rhythmic slap of the spoon, and the gradual thickening of the starch. He knew it was finished when the texture reached a precise, creamy resistance, a point where the rice was tender but still held a defiant heart. Finally, he prepared a simple salad of bitter greens and sliced pears, the crisp snap of the produce providing a sharp, bright counterpoint to the richness of the other plates. When the knock finally came, it was not the urgent, demanding rap of a courier or a supervisor. It was a slow, melodic sound, 2 beats followed by a silence. Silas opened the door to find Tenzin and Fatima, their presence bringing with them the scent of the evening mist and a quiet, grounding energy. Tenzin wore a heavy wool cardigan the color of wet slate, his prayer beads clicking softly in his hand. Fatima was wrapped in a shawl of deep indigo, her eyes crinkling with a soft, intuitive warmth that seemed to read the stillness of the house before she even stepped over the threshold. "The house smells of patience," Tenzin remarked, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He didn't wait for an invitation, he simply drifted into the space, his movements synchronized with the slow pulse of the evening. As they sat, the atmosphere thickened with a comforting anticipation. Silas served the cauliflower first, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. He noticed Fatima as she took her first bite. She didn't just eat, she closed her eyes, leaning back into the chair. He watched her shoulders, usually held with the subtle tension of someone always preparing to provide for others, finally drop. The rigid line of her posture dissolved, and for the first time, she looked less like a caretaker and more like a guest. She let out a long, slow exhale, a sound of surrender that echoed the silence of the room. "I had forgotten," Fatima whispered, her voice breathy and light, "what it feels like to be the one who is looked after." The flavor is honest. Between the courses, the silence grew, but it was no longer a void that needed to be filled. It was a shared sanctuary. Silas found himself rubbing the ceramic rim of his water glass, not out of nervousness, but as a way to anchor himself in the moment. He studied Tenzin, who was watching the candle flame with a slight, knowing tilt of his head. The conversation didn't flow in the frantic exchange of information he had known in the city. Instead, it moved like the tide, receding and returning in slow, deliberate swells. Tenzin began to speak of the lighthouse, though he didn't describe the mechanics of the lens or the schedule of the rotations. He spoke of it as a relationship. "People think the light is a warning to the ships," Tenzin said, his voice rhythmic and calming. "But for the keeper, the light is a conversation with the sea. You tell the water you are here, and the water tells you where it is restless. It is a dialogue of presence. To keep the light is simply to acknowledge that the horizon exists, and that we are small enough to be guided by it." Silas felt a profound shift in his own internal architecture. The ritual of slowing was no longer a set of exercises he was practicing to cure his burnout. It had become the foundation of who he was. He realized he no longer missed the adrenaline of the climb or the sterile prestige of the boardroom. Those things were ghosts, thin and transparent. The weight of the heavy linen, the scent of thyme, and the low hum of Tenzin's voice were the only things that felt solid. He felt a sense of belonging that was not based on a title or a salary, but on the simple, shared experience of being still in a world that refused to stop. As the meal concluded, they moved together to clear the table. There was no rush to finish, no urge to expedite the cleanup. They worked in a coordinated, silent dance, passing plates and wiping the mahogany surface with slow, mindful strokes. The intimacy of the act was quiet but absolute. They were three strangers who had found a common frequency, a shared language of breath and presence. Just as Silas was beginning to pour a final round of herbal tea, a sound shattered the peace. It was a knock at the door. Not the rhythmic, gentle greeting of the villagers, but a loud, aggressive hammering that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cottage. It was a sound of demand, of urgency, of the world he had thought he left behind. Silas froze, the teapot hovering in midair. Tenzin's prayer beads stopped their clicking. Fatima looked up, her expression one of sudden, sharp concern. The noise continued, relentless and jarring, cutting through the amber warmth of the room like a blade through silk. Silas walked to the door, his heart not hammering but feeling heavy, as if the suitcase he had set down had suddenly reappeared in his hand. He opened the door to the cool night air. Standing on the porch, framed by the swirling gray mist and illuminated by the dim porch light, was a man in a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place against the salt-stained wood of the cottage. The man's face was tight, his eyes scanning the interior of the house with a clinical, predatory efficiency. "The board doesn't accept resignations via stationery, Silas," the man said, his voice a sharp, metal-sharp contrast to the silence of Oakhaven. "We've come to discuss the terms of your return." Chapter 10. The wind at the peak of the lighthouse didn't push against Silas. It simply moved through him. He stood on the gallery walk, the iron railing cold and pitted beneath his palms, watching the gray-blue Atlantic merge with a sky the color of a bruised plum. For years, a view like this would have triggered a mental checklist: the logistics of the commute, the efficiency of the flight path, the sheer waste of time spent staring at nothing. But today, the internal noise was gone. His mind was a flat, calm sea, undisturbed by the phantom echoes of ringing phones or the frantic geometry of city grids. He didn't feel the need to conquer the horizon or use it as a backdrop for some future ambition. He was simply there, a singular point of consciousness anchored to a tower of salt-worn stone. He noticed the way the salt spray clung to his eyelashes, tiny crystalline beads that blurred the line between the water and the air. He didn't blink them away. He let the cold dampness settle on his skin, registering the temperature as a fact rather than a discomfort. His breathing had slowed to a rhythmic cadence, a slow nasal draw that felt as if he were inhaling the very essence of the coast, the brine, the rotting kelp, and the distant sharp tang of the lighthouse lantern. He felt a strange, heavy density in his limbs, a grounding that made him feel less like a man and more like a geological feature of Oakhaven itself. Behind him, the heavy iron door groaned on its hinges. Silas didn't turn immediately. He waited, listening to the footsteps. They were light, almost tentative, lacking the resonant weight of Tenzin's stride. He knew the sound. It was the cautious, drifting approach of Daiki Sato. Silas finally turned, his movement slow and deliberate, and found the artist standing a few feet away. Daiki looked small against the towering machinery of the light, his oversized sweater hanging off his shoulders like a draped canvas. He wasn't looking at Silas, but rather at the space just beside him, his gaze fixed on the swirling mist that clung to the cliffs. Without a word, Daiki reached into the folds of his coat and produced a package wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with a piece of rough twine. He held it out with both hands, a gesture of offering that felt almost liturgical. Silas took the package, the paper rough against his fingertips. He didn't rush to open it. He felt the weight of the board inside, the slight rigidity of the frame, and the lingering scent of linseed oil and solvent that clung to the wrapping. He watched Daiki, whose eyes were blinking slowly, his expression unreadable, but his presence steady. Silas carefully untied the twine, the knot giving way with a soft, satisfying snap. He peeled back the paper to reveal a watercolor. It was a depiction of the pier at dawn, the colors muted, pale lavenders, slate grays, and a sliver of lemon yellow where the sun had just broken the surface. In the center of the composition stood a figure. It was Silas. He was sitting on the edge of the weathered wood, his back slightly curved, staring out at the water. He looked perfectly still, almost carved from the same stone as the lighthouse. The painting didn't capture him in a moment of action or achievement. It captured him in a moment of surrender. Silas reached out, his finger hovering just above the surface of the paper. He touched the edge of a brush stroke, feeling the slight texture of the pigment where the paint had pooled and dried. It was a physical testament to a version of himself he had only just begun to recognize, a man who could exist without a purpose other than existence. He felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest, not of anxiety, but of a profound, heavy contentment that threatened to pull him under. He studied Daiki, who was now tracing a pattern on the iron railing with his thumb, his shyness still a thick veil between them. Yet the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. "I didn't know you were watching," Silas said, his voice soft. The long pause between the words, a natural extension of the wind's rhythm. Daiki gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, his voice barely a whisper over the gale. "The light. It stopped moving on you. You became part of the tide." Silas looked back toward the village of Oakhaven, nestled in the crook of the bay like a handful of scattered shells. From this height, the houses looked like miniatures, their chimneys releasing thin ribbons of peat smoke into the cooling air. He thought of the charcoal suit, the man from the board, and the aggressive hammering on his door. The memory didn't spark the old fire of panic or the reflexive need to defend his position. Instead, it felt like a story told about someone else, a ghost story from a life he had long since vacated. He realized he had traded the urgency of the city, the constant grinding need to optimize every second of his day for an eternal present, the phantom urge to maximize his time, to turn his peace into a productivity hack, finally vanished. It didn't leave a void. It left a space that was filled with a warm, heavy stillness. "He is waiting for you," Daiki whispered, gesturing toward the lantern room above. Silas left the painting resting against the railing and climbed the final few steps to the gallery's highest point. Tenzin was there, his silhouette framed by the massive Fresnel lens. The old keeper didn't speak as Silas approached. He simply shifted his weight, making room. They stood side by side, two men anchored to the edge of the world. The sun began its final descent, the orb dipping toward the horizon and bleeding deep crimsons and burnt oranges across the water. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful collapse of light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Silas found himself sinking his breath to Tenzin's, a deep, resonant draw followed by a long, slow release. It was a shared biological rhythm, a synchronization of two nervous systems finally at rest. The tide below hit the base of the cliffs with a rhythmic, pulsing thud, and Silas felt the vibration in the soles of his boots, a heartbeat shared by the earth and the sea. He felt a deep, heavy sense of belonging, a realization that the cost of this peace was the total surrender of everything he had once thought defined him. He was no longer a title, a salary, or a trajectory. He was simply a man standing in the wind. As the last sliver of the sun vanished, plunging the world into a deep, velvet indigo, the lighthouse mechanism clicked. With a low, metal-sharp hum, the great beam ignited. The light swept across the dark water in a slow, hypnotic arc, cutting through the gathering gloom. It illuminated the white foam of the breakers and the distant, jagged outlines of the reef. Silas watched the beam travel, noting how it didn't point toward the distant mainland or the road that led back to the city. Instead, the light swept inward, illuminating the path back to the village, back to the salt-stained wood and the smell of thyme, leading him deeper into the stillness he had fought so hard to find.